Okay, good afternoon everyone and welcome to the opening session of the Institute for Northern Studies 2022-2023 public seminar series. It's lovely to see everyone joining us for an unusual lunchtime session this afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Andrew Lind. I'm a lecturer here at the Institute and it is my great pleasure to be chairing these seminars. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have, as is custom with these seminars, a few very boring technical points that I've just got to very quickly go through. The first is just to make everyone aware that this session is being recorded and will be available on the Institute for Northern Studies YouTube channel if you want to relive any of the experience this afternoon. The other point is just about questions. Please feel free to submit any questions at any point during the presentation this afternoon. To do so, can I just ask that you use the chat function rather than the Q&A function on your screen there? And when you send in those messages, can you just make sure that they are addressed to all panelists? And that just means that nothing will fall through the gaps and we can address all questions to our speaker. Now, everyone didn't tune in this afternoon to hear me rabbit on, so it is my great pleasure to welcome to INS and to welcome to Botany Professor Wendell McConnaha. Wendell is an internationally renowned education specialist, having started his professional life as a teacher before advancing to school principal, university professor, and then university principal. He has worked for various institutions across the globe, working alongside students and educators developing programs and educational training. But Professor McConnaha isn't here today to talk about that, but his other academic pursuit, which is Scottish explorers of the 19th century. Wendell has very recently published a book entitled The King of Laconia, William Balfour Beatty, The Forgotten Man of Africa, which was published this year. And we'll be giving another paper this evening at 7 o'clock on the book for Orkney Library and Archive in collaboration with the Orkney Heritage Society, if you want to hear more about that. But this afternoon, Wendell will be discussing the broader context of his book in his paper, Losing Sight of the Shore, How Edinburgh Doctors Led the British Imperial Century. And with that, I'll now pass over to Wendell. Welcome.
Thank you. I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Andrew Lind, the University of Highlands and Islands and the Institute for Northern Studies. I'm truly honored to be here. I will apologize in advance for my pronunciation and my accent. And my wife reminds me to speak slowly. My plan is to briefly discuss the book that Andrew mentioned leading to my current research. I'm going to discuss in depth the 4 factors that led to the creation of what I've termed the Edinburgh Medical Explorers, and conclude with the factors that led to their ceasing to exist. And then hopefully have time at the end, or as Andrew said, any time during the course of the conversation for Q&A. As Andrew mentioned, this past month, The King of Laconia, William Balfour Beatty, The Forgotten Man of Africa, was published by Whittles Publishing, and he mentioned that there'll be a presentation this evening. I'm going to begin by briefly discussing the book, but that, as Andrew indicated, is not the prime focus of my presentation. That is a book that is entitled Losing Sight of the Shore, and that also is published by Whittles and due out in either January or February of this year. In 1992, I was working at the University of Chicago and traveled on their behalf to Nigeria to work on a project with Abia State University. And in my initial travels, we went by car from Lagos to Aba, where the project would be housed. And we were traveling across what was then the rainy season. Nigeria has 3 seasons, rainy season, wet season, and something called Hamartime. It gets very cool in the winter, but cool to them is still quite warm. And as we were traveling, we were going very slowly and people were walking by the car throughout the trip. And they would stick their head in the car when they would see us, and they would say, "Hello, white man," or "Hello, Inocha," which is Igbo for white man. And it's a little disconcerting, but got used to it. And after a while, we sort of ignored it. And then someone stuck their head in the car window and said, "Hello, Beatty." And I asked our driver, "Is Beatty the local word for white man?" And he said, "Yes." And then a little while later, he said, "There's more to it. Beatty was actually a man. who lived here 150 years ago that was so respected and so revered by the local population that every white man that's visited here since that time has been given his name. So Bakey became the name for white man based on their response to this person. I worked for years. I'd never heard of him, and I thought myself a reasonably good student of history. And I worked for years trying to find out who this person was, and how he could be so well known in Nigeria and be absolutely unknown to the rest of the world. Through my research, I discovered that he was a native of Kirkwall. He completed his medical studies at the University of Edinburgh. He graduated at the top of his class. He joined the Royal Navy as an assistant surgeon. I found he was a brilliant physician who conducted the first clinical trials to prove that quinine prevented malaria. Up to that point, quinine was used to treat people that had malaria, but he had a theory that if he gave it in advance of the voyage, it would result in people not contracting the disease to start with. And as a result, during his initial voyage to Africa, for the first time in history, he traveled for 6 weeks in Central Africa without losing one member of his crew. And this was at a time when 3/4 of the explorers died through fever or malaria. He also was a noted naturalist. He published 2 books before he was 22 years old on flora and fauna, one of them about his native land here in the Orkney Islands. He had 2 genera of plants named in his honor, and he was a colleague of Charles Darwin. He was an explorer who mapped and charted the entire Niger River and Benue River area, and charted and mapped all the caravan routes through much of West Africa. He was a gifted linguist. He cataloged over 50 African languages and translated the Book of Prayer and the Bible into Arabic, Hausa, and Igbo. Yet, if you look in any anthology of West African explorers, if he's mentioned at all, there are a couple sentences about his initial travels, but nothing else about him. And certainly, no one had written his biography. I found that when Bakey completed his medical studies in 1846, Great Britain was nearing the middle of what's been designated the British Imperial Century. Victory over Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815 left the United Kingdom and the British Empire the strongest, richest, and most powerful nation in the world. I was curious as to whether the characteristics clearly present in Bakey were his alone or shared with a larger group. So I first looked at the numbers and backgrounds of explorers during that period of time. In a period from 1815 to 1915, Scotland's population was 1/5 that of the population of England. But despite this discrepancy, over 1/2 of the explorers during that period, in fact, over 60% that I could identify were from Scotland. The first question immediately arose: how did a Scottish population that was 20% the size of England become the leading actor in exploring, charting, and collecting around the world? Investigating further, I found that in addition to the number of explorers disproportionately favoring the Scots, many like Bakey were physicians and surgeons who had had their training at Scottish universities, with University of Edinburgh graduates outnumbering those from other Scottish institutions by a ratio in excess of 9-1. The second question then emerged: what was unique about the preparation of Scottish doctors during this period, and those graduating from the University of Edinburgh in particular, that resulted in such a dramatic choice of vocation? Research on Bakey had created a picture of one man, but it now suggested that an entire group of Scottish doctors had selected a similar career path. William Balfour Bakey was a doctor, an explorer, and a naturalist. He was exceptional, but my research had already verified that he was not unique. Bakey and his fellow graduates were part of a newly evolved group of doctors who would not forge a career in hospitals and medical offices in Scotland and England, but rather would explore from the jungles of Africa to the ice of the Arctic, and indeed the entire world. This led to the next publication, Losing Sight of the Shore: How Edinburgh Doctors Led the British Imperial Century. I discovered during my research that there were 4 factors that these people all seemed to have in common, and 4 events that had taken place that led up to the start of the British Imperial Century in 1815. These 4 events were first the Act of Union that merged England and Scotland along with Wales into what would become known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain. However, the act specifically spared Scotland's church, legal profession, and educational system, guaranteeing they would remain uniquely Scottish. Leaders within the church, the law, and universities created the second event along this continuum, which was known as the Scottish Enlightenment. Although there was movement throughout the Scottish university system before and during the Enlightenment, among the most impactful accomplishments was the creation of a new methodology for preparing doctors. As a result, the medical network within the city of Edinburgh produced a graduate quite different than those receiving degrees from either English or Irish universities. The final variable in the development of these doctors is that the British Imperial Century required a new type of explorers. The motivation for earlier exploring had been to find new lands, establish trade routes, and create colonies. In the British Imperial Century, never before seen focuses like the economic botany and voyages simply for the sake of science needed to replace or work in conjunction with the earlier motivations. The interest in this new class of exploring began to grow, and the study and understanding of the natural world became integrated within these exploring missions alongside existing efforts to expand commerce within the British Empire. Let me spend some time discussing each of these 4 areas in some detail. First, the impact of the union between Scotland and England. Helen Dingwall, in the History of Scottish Medicine, describes the development of Scotland as a nation, beginning with a collection of very separate and locally controlled spheres of influence. In order to forge an identity that was uniquely Scottish and separate from England, attempts first had to be made to unite the spheres. But ongoing attempts to unify the nation were viewed as threats by the English and resulted in a series of battles that lasted from 1296 to 1357. At the end of the prolonged conflict, greatly assisted by Robert the Bruce's victory at Bannockburn in 1314, England was forced to acknowledge Scotland as an independent nation. The House of Bruce was followed by the House of Stuart, and by the beginning of the 17th century, the Stuart dynasty was well established. Queen Elizabeth I died leaving no heirs, and Scotland's King James VI, a Stuart cousin, was Elizabeth's closest relative. Hence, when Elizabeth died, James VI of Scotland also became James I, ruler of Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales. This became known as the Union of Crowns. Scotland and England did not merge, and upon assuming the combined thrones, James left along with his entire court for London. Scotland and England remained separate nations with separate parliaments. In 1685, James II became king. James was Catholic, but his religion was not seen as a concern, as the next 2 individuals in line for the throne, whose daughter, Mary and Anne, were born before his conversion and were members of the Church of England. But the birth of his son, who was baptized Catholic in 1688, raised the prospect that the throne would pass through a series of Catholic monarchs. Facing mounting pressure, James fled to France, and Mary and her husband William were invited by the English Parliament to leave their home in Holland and jointly assume the throne. Neither William nor Mary nor Anne had produced an heir. Again, fearing the Catholic would assume the throne, William instructed Sophia of Hanover and inserted her into the line of succession. William's decision to change the line of succession and end the reign of the House of Stuart was known as the Act of Settlement and was implemented by the English Parliament in 1701. This document stated that in the event of no legitimate issue from the ruling monarch, the crowns of England, Ireland, and Wales would pass to, quote, the most excellent Princess Sophia, Electress and Duchess Dowager Hanover, and her heirs, the heirs of her body, being Protestant. The Act of Settlement did not mention Scotland. In 1702, upon William's death, Anne became queen. She knew that the House of Hanover could not automatically assume the Scottish crown if the Scots maintained their separate parliament. So from the beginning of her reign, through skilled political maneuvering and more than a touch of bribery, Queen Anne began implementing a treaty known as the Act of Union. This would incorporate the Kingdom of Scotland, along with Wales and England, into the United Kingdom under a single parliament, which would rule from London. On January 16th, the Act of Union, merging the two countries of England and Scotland, was ratified by the Scottish Parliament, which was then dissolved. Now under a single ruler and a single parliament, these separate nations would be, in the words of the treaty, quote, united into one kingdom by the name of Great Britain, quote. Although Scotland and England had been ruled by the same sovereign for over a century, the border hostilities had continued. England sought to merger to create a more defensible single island and put an end to a series of ongoing battles with the Scots. For the English, the merger was implemented as protection for the northern border, but it also guaranteed the continuation of the Protestant line of succession. For the Scots, the benefit was economic, and the beginnings of the commercial expansion soon allowed Scotland to close the financial gap with England. It also opened up international options for the medical explorers that had not previously been available. By the middle of the 18th century, the union of two countries that had produced Scotland's economic growth also resulted in a huge increase in population to Scotland's major cities. By 1851, 1/3 of the country's population was classified as urban, and between 1740 and 1820, these rapidly forming urban centers became the focal point for what would be called the Scottish Enlightenment. Historians traditionally date the Age of Enlightenment as between 1715 and 1789. This movement was created on the European continent, specifically in France. The activities of the Age of Enlightenment began on the European continent, but its work overlapped with the Scottish Enlightenment, which is generally dated between 1740 and 1820. Christopher Barry defines the Scottish movement as both a set of institutions and a set of ideas. The institutions to which Barry refers are the three central agencies that have played conspicuous roles in Scotland's history: Scottish law, the Church of Scotland, and the Scottish universities, all of which remain untouched by the Act of Union. These bodies would unite, and the Scottish Enlightenment would grow from this unique combination of entities to form a distinctive Scottish national culture. As important as the law and the church were to the Enlightenment, the principal thinkers had their institutional and intellectual base within the universities, and the roots of the Enlightenment lay deep within the nation's educational values. As early as the late 17th century, Scotland had developed a mandatory education system for boys, and literacy and numeracy were much more widespread in Scotland than in neighboring England or in Germany and France. The secondary schools provided university preparation and were not simply for the children of the rich, but open to all boys, and a concerted effort was made to discover those with the most ability, regardless of their family station or wealth. The fact that sons of poor farmers, as well as the sons of the wealthy, were literate meant that this universal education prepared capable boys of all social strata for a university education. Great strides were made within the general population in basic literacy, but perhaps the greatest impact on education were changes to the curriculum structure and methodology found within the university. By 1750, Scotland's universities, each located within a major city, had become prominent international cities of learning and were in the forefront of new thinking brought forward by the Enlightenment. This contrasted with the setting of their English counterparts of Oxford and Cambridge, which were isolated from metropolitan areas of England. The urban location of the Scottish universities provided a significant social venue for bankers, merchants, and clergy, where they all mingled with students and professors and the intellectual mix provided within the city. These factors positioned the university communities as in the vanguard of the Scottish Enlightenment. At the time, access to Scottish universities was more open than in England, Germany, or France. This was especially true at the University of Edinburgh, uniquely founded by the town council and not by a religious order. Even from the outset, the University of Edinburgh accepted students of all faiths. Universities of Scotland also had none of the class restrictions seen below their southern border and accepted students of all social and economic classes. The tuition in Scotland was £5 per year, 1/10 the cost of attending either of the English universities. The less expensive tuition, along with the system of universal pre-collegiate education, meant the graduates from universities in Scotland were more socially diverse and much more likely to include students from working and middle-class families, as contrasted with the top-heavy landed gentry or aristocratic students found in English programs. This provided a group that would be much more receptive and able to become the explorers for Scotland. The Scottish Enlightenment saw a continuation of strengthening and improving programs and facilities within these already strong Scottish universities. Lectures moved from being taught in Latin to being taught in English. Observatories were built at St. Andrews and Aberdeen. All four universities established chairs in mathematics, law, and medicine, and the University of Edinburgh was among the first to abandon its regent system. This exposed students to numerous professors during their course of studies and improved the overall quality of the program, as the professors now only taught in areas they knew best. These changes allowed university courses to be taught in greater depth, encouraged observation and experimentation, and allowed these institutions to become internationally renowned. This put Scotland in the vanguard of new thinking and new ideas, and assured Scotland would become Europe's first modern literate society. The collaboration between church, legal system, and the universities was present throughout the Scottish lowlands, but the essence of the Scottish Enlightenment became the city of Edinburgh. As a center for both the legal and ecclesiastical communities, combined with the university that owed its allegiance to the town council rather than a church, Edinburgh quickly became the leader of the revolution, which was the Scottish Enlightenment. Third was Edinburgh's radical departure in its preparation of physicians. During the early Middle Ages, the care of the sick in Scotland was provided by monks and friars who administered hospitals connected with abbeys or priories. But in 1163, a papal edict issued by Pope Alexander III stated, quote, "Shedding of blood is incompatible with the cleric's holy duty to God," quote. Looking for a workable solution, the clerics enlisted barbers to help them care for the sick and injured. By assigning responsibilities to the barbers for procedures where contact with blood might occur, the monks could continue to operate the hospitals while maintaining compliance with the papal edict. These medical partners became known as barber surgeons. In Scotland, from the late 15th century, Edinburgh became to be dominated by the merchant and trade guilds. Tradesmen in these professions were not protected. Within these professions not protected by the incorporation were at an extreme disadvantage. For barber surgeons, the next step to becoming recognized as a profession meant incorporating as a recognized trade, and in 1505, the Town Council of Edinburgh granted a charter of incorporation, making the Incorporation of Surgeons and Barbers of Edinburgh the first professional medical organization in Scotland. Founded in 1582, the University of Edinburgh, like the Incorporation of Surgeons and Barbers, was established by the Edinburgh Town Council and was not affiliated with a religious organization. This made the university significantly different from England's Oxford and Cambridge University and Ireland's Trinity College, as each of these institutions was affiliated with the Church of England and would only accept students of that faith. Although the university did not initially have a medical school, university students could attain a medical diploma through their general studies coursework, by observing surgical techniques offered by the incorporation, and by completing courses in anatomy and the natural sciences. They could then apply to take a written examination, and if successful, be granted a degree in medicine by the university. In 1726, with 8 professors in place, the University of Edinburgh formally established its medical school. These men had long held the belief in the establishment of a teaching hospital, and in 1729, they established the Edinburgh Infirmary for the sick poor. Patients could be treated by both the Incorporation of Surgeons and the university medical students who could receive essential clinical training. In 1736, a royal charter was obtained and the name was changed to the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. The treatments within the Royal Infirmary through medical research and specialization raised the medical school's esteem within both the scientific and public communities, and the teaching hospital soon represented the pinnacle of medical achievement. Given the close geographic proximity, it might be assumed that the Scottish medical preparation, training, and practice would be somewhat parallel to that of England. However, this was true only to an extremely limited extent. In England, the medical schools stressed caring and curing. However, in Scotland, university medical instruction, in addition to courses focusing on patient care, featured a significant emphasis on both the humanities and the natural sciences. Additional courses such as meteorology, mineralogy, zoology, and geology were available to apprentices and medical students and to the public through the extramural programs designed by the Edinburgh City Council. The study of medicine in Scotland also incorporated an emphasis on clinical diagnosis and system analysis. Students learned from observation and from hands-on practice rather than simply through lecture. The growth of laboratory science and assisting in diagnosis and the hospital-based clinical research further distanced the Scottish medical graduates from the English counterparts. This allowed the Edinburgh graduates to be substantially different from both their English and Irish counterparts. The creation of the medical school in 1726 and the establishment of the Royal Infirmary in 1736 were in large part responsible for the University of Edinburgh becoming recognized as a center for, quote, systematic medical teaching established on a sound scientific basis, quote. This allowed the emphasis on practical, hospital-based teaching to become Edinburgh's hallmark and gained the medical school an international reputation for excellence in clinical instruction. By the end of the 18th century, the University of Edinburgh's medical school, which was by then the dominant faculty within the university, was arguably one of the leading centers, not just of medicine, but science throughout Europe. Finally, there was a need for a new type of explorer, specifically in the British Imperial Century. The picture is of John Ray, also an Orcadian, who made his explorations throughout the Arctic while working for the Hudson Bay Company. Among other things, he discovered the final link in the Northwest Passage and also was the one that discovered the fate of the long-lost Franklin expedition. He's one of 5 people that's profiled within the second book. The only Orcadian, but all of the rest are Scots, all the rest graduated from Scottish universities, and all the rest fell during this particular period. The Scots were endowed with what Labourn calls dourness, which literally means hardness, durability, and having qualities of iron. In addition, the Scots were educated men, and good schools were a prerequisite for good explorers. An uneducated man was at a distinct disadvantage. The survival of explorers depended on their knowledge as much as it did on physical toughness. An explorer in the Imperial Century had to be men of learning, but they also had to be men of action. The Act of Union put the measure into place that would allow medical explorers to move to the forefront of the British Empire. Options like the military, working within the joint stock companies, especially the East India and Hudson's Bay companies, and access to options and assignments within the scientific and cultural institutions located south of the border, options that were previously available only to the English were now open to the Scots as well. Opportunities were almost endless, and Scotsmen embraced them. During the Imperial Century, when Britain controlled nearly a quarter of the surface of the earth, Scotsmen predominated in every important sphere. Scotland had maintained its own army and navy for decades and continued to do so up through the reign of Charles I. But the Act of Union presented to Scotland 2 military options as avenues for gainful employment. The Scottish office of the Lord High Admiral was subsumed within the Admiralty Office of Great Britain, and the Royal Scots Navy was merged with the British Royal Navy. The vast majority of Scots officers and crewmen simply changed into the uniform of the newly formed combined force. The Scottish Army, like the Navy, was combined into one operational command. However, joining the British Army required even less of a transition, as Scottish regiments were simply transplanted as intact units into the British forces. Although the regiments were now part of the new British military establishment, they remained under the old operational command structure and retained the institutional ethos, customs, and traditions created in Scotland centuries earlier. Enlisting with the British Army or Royal Navy became a favored choice for Scotsmen looking for a better life. The number of Scotsmen who selected the British military for employment continued to dramatically increase, and while Scots constituted less than 15% of the British population at the end of the 18th century, the number of Scots serving in the British military represented 36% of the total force within the Army and Navy. Not all of the Scotsmen who entered the military did so as fighting troops. Large numbers of graduating physicians began to look at the military as a preferred career choice. The British military soon contained a disproportionately high percentage of Scottish doctors among their ranks. By the end of the 18th century, most British military doctors were Scottish, and the majority were Edinburgh trained. Stationed in foreign lands or on board ships traversing the world, these military surgeons were ideally placed to serve exploring roles in addition to their medical duties. Beyond the military, other opportunities were suddenly available following the Act of Union. Much of Britain's empire consisted of colonies, and through formal and informal alliances created by trade. Generally, throughout the course of history, governments have turned to private traders to establish commerce on their behalf. These entities are called joint stock companies. Some were quite successful, and it was the East India Company and Hudson's Bay Company which played the major role in the lives of the medical explorers. The English East India Company was formed more than a century before 1707, so it initially employed very few Scots. So shortly after the Act of Union, the company moved to establish its own military and created a private army of almost 260,000 troops, twice the size of the British Army at that time. It would serve as its military unit to provide the major inroad initially for Scottish employment. The troops were Indians called sepoys, who outnumbered the British troops in a ratio of 10-1, but the officers were recruited exclusively from populations throughout the United Kingdom, and hundreds of Scotsmen rushed to join the Army's rank. Of the 116 candidates for the officers' corps, 56 were Scots, but the large number of transplanted Scotsmen who would seek employment in India were not restricted to the Army. Soon Scotsmen became the prevailing voice and quickly dominated all aspects of the East India Company. Scots came to the company as writers, factors, traders, engineers, missionaries, planters, jute traders, and teachers. The Scots also came in large numbers as doctors and ship surgeons for the trading vessels. In 1860, of the 254 assistant surgeons within East India, 132 were Scots. In addition to the medical duties performed on behalf of the company, these medical explorers used their postings throughout India and Southeast Asia to advance exploration and international prestige for Britain. In early Canada, the fur trade was by far the dominant economic activity, but by the time the Scots began arriving, it had already been established by French in Quebec and the English at Hudson Bay. However, the Scots quickly caught up. Early in the 18th century, ships outbound for Hudson's Bay Company were in the habit of stopping for supplies in the Orkney Islands. They also soon began recruiting Orcadians for work. By 1799, 4 out of every 5 employees of the company were Scots, the majority from the Orkney Islands. When the company expanded its workforce from 180 to over 600, 3/4 of the population were Orcadians. These Orkney Islanders were joined by large numbers of workers from other parts of Scotland, and by the 18th century, Scotland so dominated the trade that Elaine Mitchell says, quote, "It would be impossible to overemphasize the preeminent position of Scots of every stripe, Highlander, Lowlander, and Islander attained during the 18th and 19th century in the North American fur trade," quote. Serving within the British Army or Royal Navy was often an entry point for the medical explorers. Stationed in foreign lands or traveling the seas during their remote assignments provided an opportunity to chart new lands, to find hitherto undiscovered plants or animals. The same was true in accepting positions with the joint stock companies. The East India Company and Hudson Bay Company were successful and served as representatives for Britain for a prolonged period of time. These commercial entities fulfilled a role that governmental agencies could not or would not assume. However, their importance to the home nation was much greater than simply their financial or even political impact. The joint stock companies also served as exploring arms for Great Britain, strategically placed to encourage the medical explorers to venture forth from their centers of trade to investigate the world. Throughout their existence, the companies provided travel and employment opportunities for thousands of Scottish men, and a joint stock company's commercial base of operation were almost often the earliest experiences for dozens of medical explorers. A better educated, middle and working class population with medical training unlike anything else in Europe prepared these doctors of Edinburgh to lead exploration in the British Imperial Century, but was also not the last. There can be no doubt that Scotsmen led the Great Britain during the Imperial Century within this 100-year period. Nor can it be refuted that a significant number of explorers were doctors who had been prepared at Scottish universities. The factors that combined to create the medical explorers of Edinburgh, the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, the Scottish Enlightenment, Edinburgh's radically new methodology in preparing physicians and surgeons, and the changing nature of exploration during a century would not have been the same results had they occurred as isolated events. But in the same way as these individual events coalesced to create the perfect opportunity for the medical explorers, as these factors ceased to exist, so did the role these people would contain in exploring the empire. With the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Britain emerged not only as a dominant naval force, but the premier industrial and commercial power. Alongside the formal control it existed over its own colonies, Britain's dominant position in the world trade meant it soon effectively controlled the economies of other areas like China and the Ottoman Empire. Exploration of the far-flung empire required travel by sea, and with no naval wars to fight, a surplus of both men and equipment, the Royal Navy provided the ships and personnel for exploration in this expanding empire. Explorers were needed to create maps and charts and to look for new routes that might enhance Britain's already strong commercial position. Facing few competitors, merchants looked to exploration for the advancement of trade. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire had largely reached its full territorial extent. This meant the need for exploration for geographic discovery or to establish new trading partners was greatly reduced. Following exploring for commercial needs, museums and botanical gardens began to attempt to quantify, categorize, and explain the world. There was a hunger to explore nature simply for the sake of science, and the medical explorers of Edinburgh emerged as the individuals best suited to perform these tasks. Collecting, both by the general public and the exploring naturalists, became almost an obsession during the early part of the British Imperial Century. It was assumed that there was a finite number of plants and animals in the world, and the overarching goal was to collect at least one of each variety. The Royal Navy had surplus ships, and Edinburgh graduates serving as surgeons on these vessels could serve as naturalists in addition to their medical duties. However, in 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. The realization that nature was constantly evolving meant naturalists were facing an impossible task in their collecting. Natural science quickly fell out of favor for both the amateur collector and the naturalist explorer. Darwin's work and the emergence of scientific specialties like botany and ornithology made natural history an irrelevant science and collecting a useless occupation, and the reign of the naturalist explorer ended. As the Imperial Century began with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it ended with the outbreak of World War I. No longer was the Royal Navy looking for ways to occupy its ships and men. Every available resource would be needed in the global conflict that would become known as the Great War. The assistant surgeons would no longer have the luxury of pairing their naval medical duties with those of the government's desire for exploration. From this point forward, the medical officers on board ship would have the well-being of the crew as their total responsibility. Finally, the Scottish Enlightenment created scientific, literary, and social community that was the envy of Europe. The Enlightenment enhanced an already strong educational system, providing a model for university education for male students regardless of social, economic, or religious status. Developments within the four Scottish universities raised them above their English and Irish counterparts, and the advancements within the medical school made the University of Edinburgh the leading institution in the world. The medical explorers benefited from the intellectual outcomes of the Enlightenment, but so did the other countries in Europe and America. Noting the benefits Scotland gained, the other countries soon followed suit, and by the beginning of the 20th century, universal education, first presented in Scotland, became more commonplace throughout the world. The innovative system of preparing doctors had proven so successful that programs throughout Europe and America now mimic these components previously found only in Edinburgh. Scotland had been first, and the rest of the world had taken note. Now the very traits that had made Edinburgh doctors unique were the standard for all, and the preparation the medical explorers had received could be found virtually everywhere. As the need for medical explorers had been created by factors only present during the 100-year period, as these factors disappeared, so did the need for the medical explorers' existence. The story of the medical explorers of Edinburgh is one of being in the right place at the right time with the right men. Their almost complete domination of this era could not have happened at any other point in history, and it likely will never happen again.
Thank you very much, Wendell. I'll just close this down just now. And at that point, I will open the floor to any questions, if we have any from the audience.
Well, perhaps I could start now.
Of course,
We're gathering their thoughts. Thank you very much for that. Very interesting indeed.
Thank you.
Notes here. Excuse me, losing my voice. I was wondering, you talk about the medical explorers, but some of them would have been missionaries, would have had a religious dimension perhaps as well. Were things more likely than the ones that went to Africa?
A good example would be another Scotsman, John Kirk, who was an Edinburgh prepared doctor, a Scotsman by birth, who traveled extensively with Livingstone, who, although Scott, was unfortunately trained in London. But having said that, Livingstone was all about spreading Christianity and eradication of slavery. And he was marginally successful at both, as history has shown. It was actually John Kirk who became consul to Zanzibar that actually ended slavery in East Africa. So they were doctors, but many of them were missionaries first and doctors second, or administrators first and doctors second. But they never completely gave up their medical role in each case. Even Livingstone continued to practice medicine and treat people that he had seen. But clearly there were people whose primary emphasis was natural science. There were some whose primary emphasis was the eradication of slavery. There are some whose primary interest was spreading of Christianity. There were some like Bakey, who was a commercial entrepreneur who was opening up to trade and worked extensively for a gentleman named MacGregor Laird, who was one of the industrialists of that particular period. So, and it sort of followed in a chronological order. First came the people opening up for trade, then came the naturalists, then came the eradication of slavery, then came the Christianization, if you will, of the Africans. But those spreading Christianity were primarily in either China or in Africa. Yeah.
It's quite interesting, the Scots missionaries too, sometimes they take that very energetic, practical approach to improving conditions.
Exactly.
And I've done some work in Vanuatu, and the Scots missionaries, they were very, very successful in eradicating slavery, but they took their eye off the ball when it came to converting, which is why Vanuatu is Catholic, as well as the native religions. But it's very interesting how they see their Christianity as being something that is actively helping.
Yeah.
And that they're actively gathering information and the thirst for knowledge that
Right.
they've obviously learned in the university as they approach to education, which is outlined so well early on in your talk there. And there's a distinct way of doing these things, I think, which is really interesting. And again, with John Ray, too, is another example of that, a person who listened to the indigenous people and gathered the information.
There's a clear indication that the people, as you absolutely are correct, that did the most successful work in exploration and in their secondary role, whether it was trade, missionary, eradication of slavery, whatever that might be, were those people that accepted the local culture. The ones that were least accepted were those that said there's a British way of doing things, and you, as the people I'm living with, need to adapt. Beatty only spoke the language of the people he was working with. He wore native clothes. He married an African woman. I mean, it was a situation where the reason he was so well accepted is he became one of them and he changed. He didn't expect them to change. When it came to their religion, he was a very religious man, but he also acknowledged that they had their own religious beliefs, and he said he was not in a position to say whether theirs were better than his or his was better than theirs. So it's been interesting to see how those, and another factor, those people within this group that were most successful were those people that were willing to adapt to the local culture. When I've done a lot of work in Nigeria, I also lived for a period of time in both Beijing and in Abu Dhabi. And at that point, the mantra that we were given was, it's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. And if you can accept that difference and embrace it, you're going to succeed. If you feel that you're better than their culture or theirs is better, any combination of that, you're probably not going to be successful. And that was certainly true of the explorers as well.
Mm-hmm. I suppose it's the inquiring mind.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, the thing that we talked about in the paper, the fact that they were analytical, the fact that they were accepting, that they were learning by observation rather than simply by lecture. All those things, I think, served the Scottish doctors well when they then got into an international setting. They looked at the whole of the culture and were able to accept those parts.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I can see a whole lot of ideas shooting up from that.
Can I maybe use this as a chance to talk a little bit more about Beatty? And I don't want to stand too much on your toes for tonight when you're talking about him in more detail, but in and around Orkney, especially around Stromness, everybody knows Ray.
Yes.
And everybody will be able to tell you that he entered into the kind of imperial networks via the Hudson Bay Company, and he is a kind of a figure within popular Orcadian history.
Yes.
Whereas Beatty is not.
Yes.
How did Beatty find himself in those imperial networks? Why do you think it is that someone like Ray has received that attention and someone like Beatty hasn't?
I think there are a couple commonalities between Ray and Beatty, and I'll talk about those in a second, but there are also a number of very substantial differences that I think cause one to be better received, if you will, than the other. I came up here via the ferry from Aberdeen and arrived a couple evenings ago. And on the ferry, because they serve both Orkney and Shetland, they had their own publication. And it just happened that the publication for this particular period was featuring St. Magnus Cathedral. And they did a brilliant job with the history. It was exactly right. They had all their facts correct. And then they listed the people who were memorialized inside the cathedral. Ray was mentioned, Beatty was not. And you can actually stand at either one of their memorials and see the other one. I mean, they're not just both in the church, they're both in the same section of the church. And to the reason why one versus the other, both of them were a bit, some would say driven, some would say stubborn. Both of them felt that they were going to do what was right, regardless of what their superiors thought. Ray, as you're well aware, got into massive amounts of trouble when he correctly reported the fate of the Franklin expedition, and when he indicated that there were direct signs that at the end they resorted to cannibalism. When that came out, it was supposed to be just for the Admiralty, but it somehow got leaked to the Times. And when that came out in the paper, he basically lost all support of Franklin's family, of people like Dickens, who was almost a member of the Franklin family, but certainly one of their biggest publicists. And so all of a sudden he started getting a lot of negative publicity. As a result, even though he won one of the 2 Royal Geographical Society's awards, he's the only Arctic explorer of that period not to be knighted, even though repeated attempts have tried to make that happen. Beatty too was someone who tended to do what he felt was right, regardless of what his superiors thought or what the normal culture was. All the things that I mentioned, that, he spoke the local language, he wore the local dress, he married an African woman and so forth, were seen as positives in Africa, and it was seen as going native by the British establishment. And when the Foreign Office was putting out saying things, regardless of what you do, every time you go out in public, always go out in your military uniform, always do X, Y, and Z. Bakey at one point refused to file any reports until, in his quote, until my government starts treating Africans as equal. And that was not in their philosophy. He was ultimately made consul for West Africa reluctantly. They actually tried to recall him. And the local people were so up in arms that they were going to lose the one person that they had faith in, that the government for once backed down and left him as consul. But when he died, and it's the other thing, Ray lived a marvelously long life and died at old age, back in the UK. Bakey died in Africa at 39 years of age, on the way home to see his father, and ironically of a tropical fever, even though he was the one that had discovered the cure for malaria, or the prevention of malaria. So I think it was a combination of the fact that he ruffled some feathers, that he was his own man and was strongly, again, opinionated / stubborn, whatever it would be, but he felt there was a right way to do things, and he did that. He refused to try to get involved in missionary work. He said that was not why he was there. So I think it was a combination of factors that, although both of them could be a bit caustic, Ray lived a longer life. Ray had much more recognition, the Geographic War. Bakey was nominated after his first voyage, but then, I'll steal some of my own thunder. When he came back, he had been elevated to head the expedition. He was supposed to be the naturalist, no command role at all. And because of the Crimean War, both the captain and the chief surgeon were called to active duty. So all of a sudden, he got promoted to the chief surgeon. Then a guy named Beecroft, who was the consul to West Africa, who was supposed to lead the expedition, died before Bakey got there. So all of a sudden, he went from, you could argue, fifth in command to leading the expedition. Then when they got out on the river, he found the captain that was to pilot the ship totally inept. And so he assumed command of the vessel as well. And this was on his first time in Africa. When he got back, the captain charged him with piracy and mutiny, and he was sent to court. The Royal Geographical Society accused him of taking credit for other people's work, because the person that had supposedly going to lead the expedition and so forth, he didn't mention in these papers. Well, they weren't with him. Why would you write about somebody who had already gone off with the Crimean War? So it was, and then the assistant surgeon who had been brought in to help him claimed credit for the entire quinine experiment, and actually published his memoir or his narrative of about 6 months ahead of Bakey. So he lost credit for the quinine, or attempted to lose credit for the quinine, was charged with mutiny. And as a result, I think, of the publicity, Royal Geographical Society withdrew the award for the following year. So there were, Ray had some of the same issues he had, but a combination of a longer life and more recognition. Bakey, for the last 7 years of his life, never even returned to the UK. And when you're in West Africa in the 1850s, you're pretty much forgotten. Mm-hmm. So
that's very interesting. A lot of his sentiments are very modern as well, and I'm thinking about all sorts of missionary work, but especially Scottish involvement in even more modern kind of places like South America, where quite late on in the kind of imperial endeavour, there's still a lot of concentrated religious work where locals aren't treated particularly well, whereas that totally flies in the face of what I'm saying about Bakey.
When I first started working in Nigeria, as I said, it was early 1990s. At the time that Nigeria became independent. They had the largest number of college graduates of any country in Africa. They had the second highest GPD, with second only to South Africa. They had a marvelous educational system that was 1/3 public, 1/3 government schools, 1/3 independent schools, and 1/3 religious schools. Church of Scotland and others still ran and Catholics still had a huge educational program. When they became independent, and I understand the logic, they very much wanted to be in charge of their own country. Unfortunately, I think the very first thing they did was say, we're going to get control of the education system. So all the independent schools and all the religious schools basically were kicked out of the country. And they then realized we now have 1/3 of the trained educators with the same amount of schools. And this is a period of time when class sizes went from 30 to 80 because they didn't have enough teachers to cover. And they've never completely recovered from that. Obviously, there have been some issues with corruption and so forth at the top of the government. But it was a situation where they never really got back to the point they were. They were literally the leader in education in Africa and are now someplace much lower. But again, it was the presence of the missionaries, which at that point in time, and we're talking about the 1950s, 1960s, up to the 70s, they were still very well received, at least in Nigeria. People had adopted, whatever it would be, into that particular mindset. And so they were welcomed. And so this was all done not at the wish of the people, but sort of a government move.
And of course, there's been a sort of a good kind of atavistic feeling about Scottish missionaries, with people like Mary Slessor, for example, who got what I understand to be practically a state funeral.
Yeah. And a marvelous, one of the best narratives of experience in writing in Africa that I've read. Yeah.
Absolutely astounding. Yeah. There was a bit of a glitch a couple of years ago here where the Aberdeen University Museum collectors were going to get rid of their Mary Slessor material or not have it on display because of slavery and things like that. I actually had to step in and point out to them that if anybody was against slavery, it was Mary Slessor, and that she'd had in fact operated in this way that had left such a good impression on people that they called her the mother of the people and all of these kind of things, and they just got it wrong. It was when there was all that great flurry about slavery, and of course Scotland, as you ably represented, clearly involved in empire and all of these things. We just have to get on with that and face it. And it was when we were just thinking about creating a new museum to look at Scottish slavery connections in Scotland there. And so on. So it just seemed to me a tremendous shame that somebody like Mary Slessor would be tarred with the brush and be some sort of Simon Legree, which was so very different, and again, so very modern, so very accepting.
Very extremely modern, and like you say, almost canonized, within the African population, just because it's interesting that you tell that story. Without mentioning the University of Chicago by name, one of my harshest critics when this book first came out was one of my former colleagues who accused me of supporting colonialism. And I thought either I didn't write it well or he didn't read it well, because what I was trying to do was show someone who was the very opposite of colonialism. It was treating people as equal trading partners. It was, it was accepting their culture, accepting their way, going in as, in one of the quotes in the book, Bakey says in his own words, the greatest title that we as white men can take is friend to Africa. And I mean, he was just very opposite, but there were some people that saw it still as a defense of colonialism. So.
I was thinking about asking that question. I didn't know whether to do it or not, but given that you're going around and you're presenting on the book and presenting at various locations, and obviously publicising the book in the States and here, have you noticed a shift in the audience and how the book has been received because of what's been going on?
Not so much a shift. I'm surprised with where the book is generating the most interest. When I wrote the book, or when I was writing the book, I'm a good writer. I'm not a fast writer. That's why I started in 1992 and I finished in, a year ago. At any rate, when I was looking for a publisher, I thought it would make sense to look for a Scottish publisher, because this is where he was from. The interest would be in the UK, so forth and so on. And to some extent, that's proven true. There's been a great deal of interest, obviously, in the Orkney Islands and in northern Scotland, where the Scottish mainland, where the publisher is located. But the next biggest source of sales has been Canada. And I know that there's a huge Scottish population in Canada, but I thought, an American author writing about a Scottish explorer, the fact that the largest number of sales would be in Canada was a bit of a surprise. I don't know the demographics of the people that are buying the book, but just from a geographic perspective, I thought the sales may be okay in the U.S. because of people that I've worked with, or for my other writing and things. But that was a great surprise that the largest interest has been in Canada.
Well, Manitoba might be the second largest francophone, but the population-wise, it's Ukrainians and Armenians.
Mm-hmm.
You see that in a lot of the place names,
right,
and the names of people too, and of course the Métis people as well.
Yeah. It's a little like Chicago is the second largest Irish population outside of Dublin.
Right, I'm just conscious of the time, but if we do have any last questions in the chat, I'll just keep that open just for a second more. This is probably a good point just to point out that if anyone is interested in picking up the book, you can do so via various booksellers in the UK. I know that Waterstones are selling it. Obviously, get it direct from the publisher as well. And it's also available in places like Amazon online if you want to purchase it from there.
Who are the publishers? Sorry, I missed them.
Wills in Caithness.
Ah, yes.
I think that's how we say it. Caithness. Okay.
That's very good.
Yes, we never say Caithness.
No, and I was saying Caithness for a long time, and I was corrected repeatedly. So, and rightly so.
Well, if there's no further questions, I'll draw the session to a close. Can I just ask everyone to join us in the traditional INS awkward online round of applause for Wendell, especially for coming all this way to give the talk. We really appreciate it, and thank you very much. I'm sure there's lots of thoughts to process this afternoon, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
All that's left for me to do is to warmly invite everyone back to the next seminar of the term, which will be taking place in our usual Thursday evening slot on the 27th of October at 7 p.m, where we'll have a paper from Dr. Graham Millen, who will be discussing the end of the Highland War, the Scots-Dutch Brigade, and the Fort William expedition in 1690. And I'm very much looking forward to that. But until then, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you to Wendell. I know you're very busy on your trip, so thank you for spending time to come and speak to us. And we will see you all again next month. Thank you.